Hey y'all, my name is Miriam, and today we are chatting all about form. Now, this isn't going to be a very academic discussion, so don't send this video to your art teachers and get me in trouble, but rather, we're going to take what I like to think is a more holistic approach to form. This video is for anyone who has struggled with grasping the idea of form on a really deep level, and for those who maybe want to achieve a higher sense of realism in their work without sacrificing the creative side. This video is going to be mainly about how I personally approach and think about form in my own portraits. We'll talk about things that I wish I would have learned sooner, what things I think you should focus on if you're struggling with form, what things I think you should skip, and practical ways that you can start adding a deeper sense of form to your portraits starting today. All right, now what is form? Well, form in the context of art and design refers to the three-dimensionality or the perceived three-dimensionality of an object or its composition. It's an element of art that involves the dimensions of height, width, and depth as opposed to shape, which only involves height and width. Now, the big thing in this definition is the word perceived, and that's because when we're talking about form in the context of painting, what we're really talking about is creating an optical illusion, a perceived three-dimensional object. We call this illusory form. It's an illusion as opposed to physical form, which can be experienced not only through sight, but through touch as well. Why is form important? Well, form is just another storytelling tool. It can help you bring depth and life to your portraits. I often employ form in selective ways to help me control how my viewers participate with my work, employing more form in areas where I want them to pay more attention, and playing off the contrast between the two areas to increase the overall visual interest of the piece. You can employ form as much or as little as you want in your work, and let me be clear, having a greater sense of form, a greater sense of three-dimensionality in your work doesn't automatically mean your work will be better or more successful. Take a look at Pablo Picasso's work, for example. Check out his self-portraits throughout the years. Many of his earlier works have a more traditional, clear sense of form than some of his later portraits. Now, that doesn't mean they're better or worse. Having a firm understanding of form and the ability to bring three-dimensionality to your work won't make you a better artist automatically, but it will allow you more creative control and freedom in your work so that you can tune the dial however you want. And that, to me, is priceless. Just remember, it's a dial, a tool, not an end goal. It can be really easy on your quest to master form to let that take over everything and let the creative side of painting slide. Remember, balance is important. I speak from experience on this one. Now, how do we find that balance? How do we start playing with and increasing the three-dimensionality in our portraits? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. For me, the conversation can be put into two camps: how we input and process form internally as an artist, and how we output it back out onto paper to create the illusion of something being three-dimensional. I found in my own journey that the discussion and online education that I could find really only focused on this side of things: how to output form back on paper or how to create the illusion of form on paper, and they didn't really focus on this side: how to think about form, how to process form and internalize it in our mind, and how to really build up the mental skills necessary to fully execute on this side. So today we're going to talk about both of these sides. Now, if you don't have trouble with this side of things, feel free to skip this part of the video. But for the rest of us, let's chat. A traditional curriculum when it comes to form might look something like this. You learn about basic shapes and volumes and how they can become the building blocks for more complex forms, and eventually how you can manipulate those forms to create even more complex things. Then you usually move on to shading and lighting. You learn how you can manipulate these things to give objects a sense of volume and space, and after that, on to perspective. While this is a really good plan, and these are all mission critical when it comes to learning about form, this was also really problematic for me because I couldn't even do step one. I would follow tutorial after tutorial after tutorial, and they'd almost always start the same way. They'd say something like, start with a sphere or a cube, add a few construction lines to orient it in space and make it look 3D, and then you have your simple shape that you can build your portrait on. And I just remember thinking, that's step one. That? I couldn't even do that. Like, I needed a tutorial before the tutorial before the tutorial, and it seemed like no one was providing that information, or like, I don't know. It seemed like this was maybe so intuitive for other people that they felt like they didn't need to explain to do this. Like in my brain, I couldn't figure out how they knew to put this line here like this, or how they knew that this angle was supposed to be larger than this angle here. It just didn't make sense in my mind. Like, sure, I could copy this, but I couldn't do it on my own. I couldn't figure out how to think about rotating that shape in space. And this wasn't a matter of practice. It was because I practiced for months and months and months just trying to get to step one. And it never felt right. I could never figure it out. And it made me really frustrated. I thought that if I can't even get to this, to step one, how am I ever going to be able to draw the things that I really want to? I felt almost as if I had a gap between these two sides. Like, I knew what form was, I knew when something looked right, and I could tell when something looked wrong. But when I thought about how to fix it or how to create it on my own, it was like my brain was full of static. So I set out to try and figure out how I can close this gap, how I can clear the fog in my brain when it came to thinking about form. And what I found out was that this gap actually has a name, or multiple names. And it turns out that I have difficulty in certain areas when it comes to visual spatial intelligence. That's just a really fancy way of saying that I have trouble when it comes to things like visual recall, imagining things in my head, rotating objects in my head, imagining things from different perspectives, stuff like that. Now, to give you an idea of someone who I would guess probably had really insanely good visual spatial reasoning skills is Kim Jung-gi. He's one of my favorite artists, and he often spoke about in interviews how he would picture a little imaginary him that would travel around the scene to view it from different perspectives and different angles all within his head. And that's how he would pick the best perspective to draw from. He also had insane visual recall skills. Now, separate from visual spatial intelligence, but somewhat related, I also have aphantasia, which means when I said I have trouble picturing things in my head, what I really meant is I can't do it at all. I used to think that when someone said, picture this, it was just a metaphor or an expression. I didn't know that people were, honest to goodness, actually imagining like pictures of things in their mind's eye. Maybe you guys have seen this viral graphic showing the apple and the different levels. And for me, it's this one. When someone tells me to picture an apple, my brain just thinks of the concept of an apple. It goes, apple. But I don't actually see anything. So you can see how something so seemingly simple as imagining a simple form and drawing it down on paper can be kind of difficult for someone who struggles in these areas, or for someone who these skills might not come so naturally to. So I set out to figure out if, one, is it even possible to improve in these skills? And two, if so, how? I knew I was never going to be able to paint and draw the things that I truly wanted unless I worked on these foundational skills. Now, the answer that I found is that yes, you can improve when it comes to visual spatial reasoning. And I found some really cool studies that showed that with simple changes and exercises, you could actually make a really big improvement in these areas in a relatively short time. Now, you might not be as extreme as me when it comes to these sort of deficits, but if you've ever struggled with internalizing or conceptualizing form and translating 3D shapes onto paper, well then these exercises are for you too. If they could help me go from 0 to where I am now, hopefully you can find them helpful as well. Exercises number 1 and 2, blind contour and cross contour studies. Now, I've mentioned these in other videos, so I'll be brief, but the goal here isn't to come out with a cool looking picture. It's to help strengthen our intuitive sense of form and space. I don't want you guys to think of this as a drawing exercise, but rather a mind exercise, one that gets our brain used to translating complex 3D objects into a 2-dimensional space. This exercise helps us to engage in our other senses beyond just sight to help strengthen our perception of form. Now, you can take this idea really far, and if you want to learn more about how to complete this exercise in a meaningful way and what it really means to engage all of your senses in form, check out my video called Developing a Tactile Mindset. Exercise number 3, sculptural drawing. Again, this exercise isn't about the outcome. It's not about creating something cool at the end. This exercise is really geared towards helping you to start thinking volumetrically. It's about feeling and understanding the form as if you were sculpting it with your hands. How to do it. Begin with a midtone to establish your solid shape. Now, imagine instead of paint, each brushstroke is a strip of clay, either adding or subtracting volume. It's like sculpting. You're not just painting, you're carving. You're carving out the cheeks, you're gently molding the curve of an eyebrow, or carefully shaping the bridge of a nose. This exercise allows you to connect more deeply with the form you're creating. It's another one that helps build upon your perception of form and turns drawing or painting into a multi-sensory experience. It's a mental and artistic workout that strengthens your ability to think and create in 3 dimensions. Tip number 5. And this one isn't as much of an exercise as it is just a language shift, and that's using spatial language when you're painting. Now, don't be too quick to write this one off as simple or unnecessary. Studies have shown that when students were taught about visual spatial intelligence and given spatial language to use, they performed better on visual spatial tasks than students who did not use spatial language. Now, what does that all mean in English? Well, simply put, when I'm painting, I'm not thinking, oh, I need to paint the forehead lighter here. I'm thinking, I need to push this area further out into space. As I round the brow bone into the eye socket, I'm not thinking, oh, I need to paint this area darker. In my head, I'm saying to myself, oh, I need to paint this area further back into space. I'm always trying to think in terms of space and how my subject relates to it. It's a really small change, but changing your internal dialogue when you're painting can make a really big difference. There's a ton of other exercises that you can do to help build up your visual spatial foundation. Exercises like drawing complex shapes from different perspectives, memory drawing, or even just working with a 3D media like clay. These are just the exercises that I have found that have really helped me with the type of portraits that I like to do. All right, now that we've talked about all of these exercises that can help us to build up our mental muscles so we can better understand and perceive and internalize form, now let's talk about how we actually depict it on paper. As I said in the beginning, this isn't going to be a very traditional or academic talk. This is more me taking you guys inside of my brain of how I think and approach form. And so I'm gonna show you guys my process briefly, but I don't want this video to be about my process when it comes to painting. What I really want for you guys to get out of this are easy and concrete ways that you can start employing form in your own work. For me, form is everything. I approach all of my portraits with what I call a form-first mindset. That means as early on in the process as I can, I try to capture the overall form on the canvas. This means that I'm not thinking about details or accuracy at this stage. What I'm really trying to do is activate this side of form, how I internalize it and how I process it. And I'm trying to activate it as soon as possible and to the fullest extent. Remember, form is an illusion, the illusion of something being 3-dimensional. It's really hard to get other people to believe in that illusion if you don't believe in it yourself first. Now, let's take a look at this portrait I just finished. I stopped to record myself in one of the earliest stages so that you can see what's going through my mind and how I'm processing this work, even in the earliest stages. All right, I'm back. Let's talk about this craziness for a second. It's chaotic, it's weird, it's unplanned, it's a mess. But what does it have? It has shape. It has form, or at least the beginnings of shape and form, right? Like when I'm looking at this in my head, I can feel the form. Those are the 2 foundations that you need for a good portrait. All right, even though that was ugly as all get out, ugly and crazy looking at that stage, you could see I was still really confident in the progress because I could feel the form already. Now, notice I said feel the form. And if you rewind to me in the early stage, I said I could feel the form there too. Now, I'm not using that word feel as a metaphor. Remember when I brought up that video about tactile mindset? Yeah, I'm experiencing form beyond just my sense of sight. I basically gaslight myself into believing that these forms are real. It's like inside of my brain, I'm processing illusory form as physical form. Now, this isn't something that I made up. This is from the teachings of Nicolaides, where he teaches you to experience form and drawing through all of your senses, especially touch. Okay, back to this. I think this method allows me to be incredibly free and build my portraits in a fun and organic way. But let me be clear, this method is not for everybody, and that's totally okay. There's a lot of trade-offs with this method, and it personally works for me, but it might not work for you. I just wanted to explain a little bit about my thinking in the early stages, how much I am focused on form, and why my process might look different from somebody else's. Now let's get to the fun stuff. How our eyes work in perceiving depth and 3D-ness. Traditionally, the science of how we perceive depth is taught in the context of the two types of cues our eyes and brain use: binocular and monocular cues. Binocular cues involve the use of both eyes and are based on their slightly different views of the world. This difference, known as binocular disparity, allows our brains to gauge the distance and depth of objects. It's the principle behind those 3D glasses that we all wear at the movies. However, in the world of art, we typically rely more on monocular cues, since paintings and drawings are typically done on a flat, two-dimensional surface. Monocular cues include texture, linear perspective, inner position, relative size, light and shadow, atmospheric perspective, and line and edge. The fun part as an artist comes in getting to manipulate and play with all of these cues to either enhance or reduce the sense of depth and overall 3D-ness, the overall sense of form in our portraits. Let's start with light and shadow. Light and shadow are perhaps one of the most effective ways that you can portray form in your portraits. I play with this a lot in my work and often push the contrast between the two to really enhance that sense of depth. I give my most attention to the transitions between the dark and the light. Transitions are really important when it comes to indicating form. It signals to the brain a plane shift. The smoother the transition, usually the smoother the form is, whereas hard transitions tend to indicate hard edges. I play with this idea a lot in my work. I render out my transitions, or more specifically my terminators, pretty fully, and I leave the rest kind of choppy. It's a really fun way to add a strong sense of form while still being loose in your work. The second thing to watch out for when it comes to light and shadow is value compression. We tend to think about light fall off in a linear fashion, where things go from light to dark at an equal rate, but usually it's a lot more dramatic than that. The difference between the light point here by the highlight isn't that much different than the light point here closer to our shadow, but the difference between this point and this point is quite large. Paying extra attention to the strong shift of value and color at the terminator makes a huge difference in how effectively I can portray form. I do this a lot in my work. I reserve my craziest and my biggest brushstrokes for the large areas of value, either lights or darks. But as soon as I approach the terminator, the shift between light and shadow, I normally render those out pretty fully. Remember that portraits are not just floating shapes in isolation. They interact with the environment and the things around them. So look for moments of reflected light in your portraits. This is another one of my favorite things to play with to enhance the three-dimensionality of my work. If you want to see a demo on reflected light and how I use light and shadow and color to enhance form in my portraits, check out my video titled Bringing Flat and Boring Paintings to Life. Let's talk about color and some of the visual cues that color provides when it comes to depth. Take a look at these two shapes. Which one would you say is closer to you? If you said the one on the left, majority of people would agree with you. Researchers have done studies and found that color plays a role in depth perception, and knowing these visual cues, we can incorporate them in our paintings to make things appear closer or further away. Combined with our use of light, this can be a really fun way of enhancing form. When we look at the human form, we can see patterns in how color typically behaves. Under most lighting setups and skin tones, our shadows will appear not only darker, but more saturated in color as well. We'll also tend to find an increase in warmth as our form approaches the terminator. You'll also find a demo of this in my video titled Bringing Flat and Boring Portraits to Life. Incorporating these visual cues allows me to really enhance the sense of form in my portraits while still being free and crazy with my colors and brushstrokes. The other visual cue that I like to rely upon a lot in my portraits when it comes to form is texture. Now, typically as objects go further back into space, the less texture you can make out. You can play with this in your work by using more textured or heavier brushstrokes for the things that appear closest to the viewer. The same thing applies to contrast. Contrast in terms of color, value, texture, whatever. Typically, things closer to you in space have more contrast, especially in terms of value. I'll often play with this by reserving the most contrast for areas that are coming closest to the viewer, like the nose, to make it really feel like it's popping out. You can play with all of those visual cues that I listed out to help enhance the sense of depth and the overall sense of three-dimensionality in your work. These are just the ones that I personally like to play with the most. Remember, it's all about balance. The things that we talked about today are just tools at your disposal. How and if you use them are up to you. Also, don't forget about the basics. Things like studying perspective, practicing your rendering and shading, and just gaining confidence creating 3D shapes will take you a long way. There is no right or wrong way to do art. Form is just another thing for you to play with and have at your disposal. And the things that we talked about today is in no way a comprehensive overview of form. It's just the way that I, a person who early on really struggled mentally to grasp form, how I personally approach it today. Now, if you've made it this far, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, or maybe you found one or two things that you can take away from it. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Consider subscribing either here or over on Patreon. These videos would not be possible without the support of people like you. So thank you and bye.